Imagine being 14 on your wedding night, stripped of privacy, surrounded by villagers waiting to inspect the blood-stained sheets. Imagine believing your womb could wander inside your body, possessed like a demon. This isn't fiction, it was daily life in medieval Europe. A world where priests monitored positions in bed, menstruation was poison, and rape victims were blamed for their own pregnancies. Welcome to a time when sex was fear, knowledge was heresy, and the human body became a battlefield between desire and dogma. Imagine your wedding night isn't a moment of love or privacy, but a public trial. The bedchamber isn't empty, it's crowded with relatives, servants, or even villagers. Everyone waits for one thing: blood on the sheets. A stain not of passion but of proof. Proof of your virginity. Proof that the transaction was valid. Proof that your body belonged wholly and legally to your new owner, your husband. This wasn't a nightmare. This was medieval Europe. Between the 5th and 15th centuries, sexuality wasn't simply repressed. It was weaponized, controlled, dismantled, reassembled under the gaze of religion, superstition, and misogyny. Behind every law, every sermon, every medical text, stood a fundamental truth: human desire terrified those in power. In this world, your body was not your own. It was an object of scrutiny, a container for sin, a tool for producing heirs. Especially if you were a woman. The medieval understanding of the human body was a grotesque blend of theology and pseudoscience. The church taught that lust was a gateway to damnation, yet paradoxically demanded that married couples procreate. Not out of love. Out of duty. Not for joy. For control. Virginity wasn't a concept. It was a commodity. Young girls were married off before they could understand what the word bride meant. At 12, a girl was considered old enough to consent. Not by her choice but by the church's decree. Consent in medieval canon law was not about free will. It was about utility, about making sure alliances were secured, bloodlines were preserved, and property changed hands without disruption. The church, which preached chastity from the pulpit, orchestrated some of the most disturbing rituals behind closed doors. Public consummation wasn't rare. In some noble households, witnesses stood just beyond the bed curtain, ears pressed to the wood, waiting for the sounds of completion. In others, blood-stained sheets were paraded in the streets the morning after, proof that the transaction and the conquest had been successful. For the peasantry, it could be even worse. One-room huts offered no privacy. Family, neighbors, livestock, all were silent spectators to the most intimate of acts. Some regions observed the consummation with the entire wedding party remaining in the same space, separated by only a curtain or screen. Not for ritual. For validation. For control. And if there was no blood on the sheets? Then came the accusations. Medical understanding of virginity was not just flawed, it was lethal. Physicians believed the hymen was a seal that must break and bleed during first intercourse. They didn't know it could stretch or tear from other causes. They didn't care. If there was no bleeding, the bride was shamed, the marriage questioned, and the consequences fell solely on her. Desperate women resorted to deception. Vials of chicken blood hidden beneath sheets. Herbal douches to tighten muscles. Even primitive surgical attempts to fake a hymen. Not out of malice, but out of sheer survival. Virginity wasn't just spiritual or cultural. It was legal. It was economic. Laws punished rape more severely if the victim was a virgin, not to protect her but to compensate her father or husband for their loss. Her body was his asset, and any damage had to be paid for. This was not morality, it was accounting. And the church, the supposed guardian of purity, played both sides. It condemned sexuality outside marriage, but celebrated the same sexual violence if it served power. Lords claiming the right to sleep with brides on their wedding night. Priests condemning fornication while secretly keeping mistresses. The doctrine was clear. Women's bodies were vessels, not people. And yet, desire endured. Behind all the cruelty, behind the stone walls and stained glass, human beings still loved, still longed, still found forbidden moments of connection, even if it meant risking everything. It's in that tension, between repression and resilience, that the real story of medieval sexuality begins. In medieval Europe, sex wasn't just a private act. It was a regulated, surveilled, and morally policed minefield. The church, towering in both political and spiritual authority, cast a long shadow over the bedroom. Its reach extended into the most intimate corners of human life. And it had a rule, or rather 1,000 rules, for how, when, and why a person could make love. Sex was forbidden on Sundays. Also on Wednesdays. And Fridays. It was banned during Lent, Advent, Easter week, Whitsun week, and every saint's feast day. It was forbidden during pregnancy, while breastfeeding, during menstruation, and on the eve of communion. When tallied, these restrictions left married couples with fewer than 50 permissible days per year to have sex, and even those days came loaded with guilt. But it wasn't just the timing of sex that was regulated. It was the position. Only the missionary position, man on top, woman beneath, was permitted. Not because it was more natural, but because it mirrored the church's concept of divine hierarchy, male dominance, female submission. Any deviation, woman on top, from behind, standing, was branded sinful, dangerous, demonic. Manuals for confessors, thick volumes that instructed priests on how to extract detailed sins, included entire sections on sexual posture. Confession became something more than spiritual cleansing. It became surveillance. Priests were told to ask questions. Specific ones. Have you ever placed your mouth upon the member of your husband? Have you used any device, in the shape of the male organ? Parishioners, often illiterate and terrified of damnation, answered. In detail. The confessional booth became the church's most potent spy tool, turning the private into the punishable. But it didn't end there. The concept of conjugal debt further blurred the lines between sanctified love and institutional coercion. Church doctrine taught that spouses owed each other sexual access, on demand. Denying your partner could be considered a sin. Even grounds for annulment. For women, this meant their bodies were never fully their own. Exhausted from childbirth? Injured? Simply uninterested? None of that mattered. To refuse your husband could be taken as evidence of infidelity, or worse, moral rebellion. And when punishment came, it came unequally. A nobleman caught committing adultery might be fined, or simply given a few prayers as penance. A peasant woman? She could be stripped naked and whipped through the streets. Homosexuality, branded sodomy, carried penalties ranging from public mutilation to burning alive. In medieval Europe, a woman's body was not her own, it was property. A sealed vault of value. Her virginity? A commodity. Her womb? A battleground. Her sexuality? A transaction brokered by fathers, husbands, and priests. Marriage wasn't the culmination of love. It was a contract signed in flesh, sealed in blood. And that seal was expected to be literal. For the nobility, the wedding night was a ritual steeped in performance. Witnesses might stand outside the bridal chamber, listening for satisfactory sounds. In some regions, the blood-stained bed sheets were proudly displayed at dawn, a grotesque banner of proof that the bride had been pure and the groom virile. Among the lower classes, privacy was even more scarce. The wedding party often remained in the same room, separated only by thin curtains or creaking wooden partitions. It was not intimacy. It was surveillance. But it wasn't just spectacle. It was economy. Laws placed literal prices on a woman's virginity. Rape of a virgin carried higher fines than that of a non-virgin, and the payments didn't go to the victim, but to her male guardian. A woman's purity was his investment. Her violation? A financial loss. And if she failed to bleed on her wedding night? She risked being accused of infidelity, of deceit, or worse, because medical science of the time was not science at all. Physicians believed the hymen was a perfect seal, a biological barrier that only intercourse could rupture. That it should tear. That it should bleed. Any deviation from this myth invited suspicion, shame, and punishment. The consequences were deadly. Women falsely accused of fornication. Rape victims dismissed because their hymens were already broken. Some families, desperate to protect their daughters' reputations, resorted to fraud, hiding vials of animal blood beneath bed sheets, performing painful pre-wedding rituals to mimic bleeding, even attempting crude surgeries to restore virginity. And if proof was demanded? Midwives, often the only ones allowed to examine women, were summoned to conduct invasive inspections. These weren't medical procedures. They were state-sanctioned violations. Hands unwashed. Instruments unsanitized. The examination itself could inflict trauma, both physical and social. A woman declared non-virgin by a midwife could lose everything. Her marriage, her status, her future. This obsession with virginity fueled a black market of desperation. Ancient herbal astringents to tighten vaginal muscles. Blood-soaked linens prepared in advance. Quiet agreements with sympathetic midwives. It was a theater of survival, played out under the gaze of law, God, and society. And yet, nowhere in these scripts of shame was the woman's voice. Medieval medicine, steeped in mythology and misogyny, treated female sexuality as pathology. The wandering womb, a supposed sentient organ, was believed to detach and float freely inside the body, causing hysteria, choking, madness. The cure? Regular sex, because male pleasure was the remedy for female disorder. Female orgasm wasn't just misunderstood, it was weaponized. Some physicians argued that pregnancy could only occur if a woman climaxed, a horrifying claim that led to brutal legal outcomes. If a rape victim became pregnant, the law presumed she had enjoyed it, and therefore consented. This wasn't just ignorance. It was doctrine turned blade. And all of it, the virginity tests, the bleeding sheets, the wandering womb, served a larger function: control. A woman who controlled her body was a threat. A woman who knew her body was dangerous. Yet despite this, women found ways to fight back. They formed secret networks: mothers, daughters, midwives, whispering truths beneath the weight of silence. They passed down folk knowledge, coded in lullabies and herbal rhymes. They learned to survive, to protect, to deceive when necessary. Because in a world where purity was currency and ignorance was law, knowledge, real knowledge, became rebellion. But again, enforcement was wildly inconsistent. In some places, priests turned a blind eye. In others, religious authorities launched purges, public trials and executions aimed at rooting out sexual deviance in their communities. Often those accused were simply people who defied social norms. Unmarried, childless, different. The hypocrisy ran deep. Priests themselves were bound to celibacy. In theory. In reality, clerical concubinage, priests keeping mistresses and fathering children, was so widespread that some dioceses began taxing it. Their illegitimate children were called priests' bastards. Officially invisible, yet quietly accepted. Educated, fed, protected, and then hidden. Meanwhile, those same priests delivered fiery sermons about the evils of lust and fornication. But perhaps the most disturbing injustice was reserved for the victims of sexual violence. A woman who reported rape faced not compassion, but interrogation. What was she wearing? Had she screamed? Had she fought hard enough? Had she bled? The law required that she cry out continuously, that she bear visible wounds, that she report the crime immediately. Any hesitation, any silence from trauma, was considered proof that she had consented. And if she failed to prove her case, she could be whipped, imprisoned, even executed, for false accusation. It was a system where the only safe option for most women was silence. A world where justice itself became another weapon against the weak. And all of it, the confessions, the restrictions, the double standards, came wrapped in the language of piety. Sin was not simply punished. It was engineered. And yet, even in this labyrinth of oppression, people found ways to love, to rebel, to survive. In medieval Europe, sex wasn't just personal, it was policed like a crime. Not by kings or guards, but by priests. The church drew a map of when, how, and why couples could engage in intimacy. And that map left almost no room for love. Sex was forbidden on Sundays, God's day. Also on Wednesdays and Fridays, days of fasting. Lent, Advent, Easter week, Pentecost, feast days of apostles, martyrs, and virgins. Sex was banned during pregnancy, after childbirth, and while breastfeeding. Menstruation? Absolutely forbidden. Count the days. A married couple had fewer than 50 days a year when sex was permitted. The goal wasn't purity, it was guilt. The church wanted every sexual impulse laced with shame. And for that, it built a machine of spiritual surveillance. Confession. Confession wasn't just about sins of the soul. It became an interrogation of the bedroom. Priests were trained to ask detailed, humiliating questions. What position? How often? Did you enjoy it? Penitential manuals, medieval sex guides in reverse, listed punishments for every deviation. Woman on top, fast for 40 days. Entry from behind, a year of bread and water. Oral sex. Don't even ask. Why such obsession with positions? Because only one, missionary, was seen as holy. Man on top, woman beneath. It mirrored the divine order. Any pleasure-seeking, any role reversal, was labeled unnatural, demonic. And yes, demons were believed to be lurking. Church fathers warned that sex in the wrong position could summon evil spirits. A climax at the wrong hour might open the soul to possession. A moment of pleasure could be a pact with the devil. So people confessed, terrified, ashamed. And from their secrets, the church built power. But confession wasn't the only way sex became surveillance. Enter the doctrine of conjugal debt, the belief that spouses owed each other sex on demand, especially wives. Denying your husband could be grounds for annulment, or worse. Exhausted? In pain? Pregnant again? It didn't matter. Saying no was a sin. This created cruel contradictions. A woman was told to be modest, chaste, and self-denying, but also obligated to perform sexually whenever demanded. Refuse and you risked being cast out. Comply and you risked your health, your life. And what of punishments? They weren't just spiritual. They were brutal, public, and class-based. A nobleman caught in adultery might pay a fine. A peasant woman? She could be stripped naked and whipped through the village. Men had leeway. Women had chains. Homosexuality was punished with ferocity, called sodomy, conflated with heresy. The penalties? Castration, exile, or burning alive. Yet enforcement was inconsistent. Some regions looked away. Others staged moral purges. The hypocrisy reached new heights in the church itself. Priests were sworn to celibacy. But many kept mistresses openly. Entire dioceses taxed priests for their concubines. Their children were labeled priests' bastards, technically illegitimate, but often educated and protected. These same priests would lecture peasants about lust. They would invade bedrooms, ask invasive questions, and decide whose desires were sinful. The gap between doctrine and reality was wide. But for ordinary people the cost was real, lives shaped by guilt, fear, and control. And for victims of sexual violence, the church offered no refuge. A raped woman had to prove she screamed, loudly, constantly, during the attack. If she didn't fight hard enough to get injured, it was assumed she consented. Delay in reporting? That was proof she lied. The law required women to risk death just to be believed. And if they weren't, which was often, they faced the same punishment as their rapist. Fines, beatings, even execution. The system wasn't blind to injustice. It was built on it. If you thought superstition was confined to religion, wait until you see what passed for science in the medieval world. Doctors, the so-called learned men of the age, believed a woman's womb was a creature unto itself. A wandering, restless organ that could float freely through her body, suffocating her lungs, causing seizures, even driving her mad. They called it the wandering womb. And the cure? Sex. Regular, penetrative intercourse to keep the womb anchored in place. Ideally in marriage, under church law, of course. This was not fringe theory. It was mainstream medicine, rooted in ancient Greek ideas but twisted by medieval ignorance. A woman in distress? Clearly her uterus had strayed. Treat her with sex, not compassion, not care. Even worse, pleasure itself was dangerous. Or, depending on context, required. Physicians believed conception could only happen if both partners orgasmed. Sounds surprisingly progressive, until you realize the consequences. If a woman became pregnant after rape, the church and the courts reasoned. She must have enjoyed it. Must have consented. Thousands of victims were silenced by this lie. Their pregnancies became proof of complicity. Their trauma dismissed. Their attackers protected. And menstruation? That natural, cyclical process was treated like a biohazard. Medieval texts claimed menstrual blood could kill crops, sour wine, shatter mirrors, cause leprosy in unborn children, even rot steel. Women were banned from preparing food, attending church, or even touching their families during their period. Menstrual blood was poison, both literal and spiritual. Yet the grotesque medical myths didn't stop with women. Male sexuality was wrapped in paranoia too. Semen was believed to be refined blood, formed in the brain, traveling down the spine, and stored in the testicles. Every ejaculation was a spiritual and physical loss. Masturbation? A threat to sanity. Excessive sex? A cause of madness and blindness. Impotence too had its remedies, and they were nightmarish. To restore virility, some were prescribed. Ground rhinoceros horn. Burning nettles applied directly to the genitals. Mercury-based concoctions that poisoned slowly from within. And that was just the beginning. Contraception and abortion lived in the shadows. Hidden knowledge passed between midwives, mothers, and herbalists. They used pennyroyal, Queen Anne's lace, tansy, herbs that could prevent pregnancy or cause death. There was no safe dosage, no medical supervision. Just whispered recipes and desperate hope. The church condemned these practices as heresy. But for many women, especially the poor, they were survival. A sixth pregnancy could mean starvation. A seventh could be fatal. Better to risk the herbs than bury another baby. Midwives walked a tightrope. To some, they were angels, delivering life. To the church, they were witches in disguise. Too much knowledge about the body? Too many successful procedures? That was enough to make you suspect. And then came the real horrors, the treatment of disease. Syphilis, the great pox, was treated with mercury vapor baths. Victims were locked in hot rooms, forced to inhale toxins until their teeth fell out and their minds shattered. Gonorrhea? Cured with acidic metal rods inserted into the urethra. Pain wasn't the side effect, it was the plan. Suffering was seen as penance for sexual sin. Pregnancy and childbirth were no safer. Physicians and midwives operated with bare, unwashed hands. Germs were unknown. Infection was rampant. Puerperal fever, childbirth infection, killed up to 1/3 of new mothers. Difficult labor? The solution was to use craniotomy hooks, sharp metal instruments inserted into the birth canal to dismember the fetus for removal. C-sections were performed without anesthesia, knowing the mother would die within hours. The motto seemed to be, pain is preferable to nature. Intervention is better than mercy. These were not isolated horrors. They were systemic, rooted in a worldview where women's bodies were dangerous, uncontrollable, and always in need of restraint, medical or moral. And the more dangerous the knowledge, the more determined the church and male authorities became to silence it. But that silence would not hold forever. In medieval Europe, sex was never just a private act. It was a public affair, a moral battleground policed by priests, reinforced by law and weaponized by power. The church didn't simply discourage sex, it mapped out every permissible moment for it. Intercourse was forbidden. On Sundays, on Wednesdays and Fridays. During Lent, Advent, Easter week, Whitsun. On feast days of saints and martyrs. During pregnancy, menstruation, and breastfeeding. Tally it all up, and married couples were left with fewer than 50 days a year where sex was technically allowed. And even then, only in the missionary position. That's right. Only one position was considered moral. The man on top, the woman beneath, silent and still. Anything else, from rear entry to woman on top, was seen as unnatural, sinful, even demonic. This wasn't just advice, it was law. Penitential manuals, the confessional playbooks of priests, prescribed years of punishment for disobedience. Bread and water fasts, public shame, and spiritual exile for a tilted pelvis. Confession became the most disturbing form of sexual surveillance. Priests were instructed to probe the intimate details of their parishioners' sex lives. What positions did you use? Did your wife enjoy it? Did you spill your seed outside her womb? Did she use any device, shaped like a man? These weren't spiritual questions. They were invasions, codified into scripture and delivered behind thin wooden screens. And if a woman confessed to denying her husband's sex, she could be guilty of withholding conjugal debt. Church law held that spouses owed each other sexual access. Denial wasn't a personal choice. It was a sin, one that justified annulment or worse. A woman recovering from childbirth? Still expected to perform. A husband lustful after 3 weeks of Lent? The debt was due. The punishment for breaking sexual rules depended entirely on who you were. A nobleman caught with a mistress? Likely a fine. A peasant woman accused of adultery? She might be stripped and whipped through the village. Homosexuality, broadly condemned under the term sodomy, was conflated with heresy, carrying penalties from castration to burning at the stake. And yet, enforcement was wildly inconsistent. Some areas turned a blind eye, others staged public executions. Perhaps the most grotesque contradiction? The church's own priests. Celibacy was the law, but clerical concubinage was so widespread, many dioceses simply taxed priests for keeping mistresses. Their illegitimate children, priests' bastards, were everywhere. Officially invisible. Quietly tolerated. These same priests who fathered children out of wedlock also presided over public virginity tests, rape trials, and bedroom confessions. But nowhere was the system's cruelty more apparent than in how it treated victims. A woman who reported rape faced a gauntlet of disbelief. Had she screamed? Fought? Reported it immediately? If not, it wasn't rape. It was consent. Worse, if she became pregnant, the law declared she must have enjoyed it, and therefore lied. Even worse, if her accusation failed, and most did, she faced the same punishment as the alleged rapist. Fines, whipping, execution. And if a pregnancy occurred? Some women, desperate to avoid shame or punishment, claimed they had been raped by demons, ghosts, spirits, any lie to protect their lives and their dignity. But rape wasn't the only sexual crime to reveal the system's rot. Prostitution was simultaneously outlawed and regulated. Cities ran brothels like businesses, requiring inspections and registering sex workers. But when the moral winds shifted, those same women were arrested, beaten, or killed. They were used, then discarded. Religious boundaries created even more horror. Sex between Christians and Jews, or Christians and Muslims, was outlawed. The Christian might receive penance. The Jewish or Muslim partner. It wasn't just religious purity. It was about control. Segregating communities by fear and punishment. But the darkest perversion of sexual control came during the rise of the witch hunts. Witchcraft, they claimed, was a sexual crime. Women were accused of sex with demons, stealing penises, casting spells to cause impotence, using herbs to cause miscarriage, practicing sexual magic. The torture was explicitly sexual. Women were stripped, shaved, probed, stabbed, and burned, not just to extract confessions but to humiliate and destroy. The witch's chair had spikes positioned to pierce the genitals. Midwives and herbalists, women with real knowledge of the body, were declared witches. And when their remedies failed or a child was stillborn, the mob came for them. This was not about magic. It was about terror, control over women's bodies disguised as faith. And in this darkness, women survived, just barely. They passed on knowledge in coded lullabies. They used humor to teach daughters about sex. They created networks of survival under the nose of the church. The medieval world tried to erase women's sexuality, to burn it, bleed it, silence it, but it didn't succeed. It never has.